thank you, James, for joining us here today to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done on misinformation and disinformation. But first, we would love to know a little bit about you, about your work and your research.
Sure, thanks. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta. I'm also an Amii Fellow, and I think a lot about three things in various combinations. I think a lot about modeling how incentives change how people interact and entities, firms even. And I think a lot about how specifically people interact and think about interactions. Goodness, so many interactions. And then on top of all of that, I use machine learning. So I think about how does machine learning change how people interact? How does machine learning allow us to influence how people act just by changing the incentives that they face? And also, how can we use machine learning to understand how people interact? So how can we use it to study what people do and what influences their behavior?
Okay. Because, yeah, when you were talking right at the start there, is kind of, you talked a lot about humans. So I was sort of wondering,
yes,
well, where does the AI come into this? But
yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of ways that AI comes into it. First of all, it's just the standard machine learning tools that I mentioned. But also, AI is really about, in my opinion, it's really about building agents and understanding agency. And so an agent is anything that acts. A lot of what we do in AI is we're building models and systems that are going to try and do something. But a lot of the time, we assume that there's just one thing doing something. Our system is the thing that's doing something. And that's really not how the world works. The way the world works is there's lots of agents out there. They all have their own priorities. They all have their own goals. They're not all under the control of the person who's building one agent. And once you have that kind of situation, the way that these guys interact is different. It's qualitatively different. And it produces all kinds of different effects. And so the way that I think about that is using game theory. That's just a mathematical way of thinking about interactions between agents that all have their own priorities. And I claim that that's a really important part of AI. Really understanding how you get multiple agents to interact is something that we need to figure out if we're going to successfully work on artificial intelligence.
Okay, so we're kind of taking the lessons that we learned from how people interact with other people and translating that when we're building these models.
Absolutely. So the classical game theory is very much a mathematical field. It starts from assumptions and then thinks about what are the implications of those assumptions. Mm-hmm. But one of the assumptions that it makes is that everybody's perfectly rational. And so it makes these predictions that turn out not to match up super well with what happens in the real world.
Not my experience.
It turns out that people are not all perfectly rational. You might know some who aren't.
There might be
you
some
might be some.
I might constantly be some, yes. And so part of what's different about my work is exactly bringing in understanding what people are doing as well. So I use a certain kind of game theory called behavioral game theory that incorporates modeling how people act and how people really reason about these situations, even though they're not magic. They can't perfectly optimize any function. They have to work with the information they have.
Very cool.
So when we're talking about that sort of interaction online, one of the things that comes up and that I know you work on is the spread of misinformation and disinformation online. It comes from these like agents interacting together, information spreading in certain ways. So maybe we could start with, what is the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
For sure. So misinformation is just information that's wrong. So anytime I misinform you, I've told you something that is false. But it doesn't include intent. So I can misinform you innocently. Disinformation is specifically misinformation that is on purpose. So I'm trying to deceive you. And so the work that I do is really about disinformation. Misinformation it's a problem. You don't want people to say things that are false, but it's not an incentive problem. Disinformation is an incentive problem because you've got some group of people who presumably would prefer not to be falsely informed. And then you've got another group of people who want to falsely inform them. Mm-hmm. And so their incentives are very different. The disinformers really want to trick you. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of misinformation that I study specifically.
And so what are the sort of harms that come from that misinformation, disinformation?
Yeah. So there's all kinds of things, right? So first of all, when you're thinking specifically about online disinformation, one thing that happens is this sort of diffuse lack of trust, right? People aren't dummies. They'll notice that there's a lot of nonsense out there. And so they'll start to trust less in information that they get, which makes our information technology less useful. A little bit more specifically, though, you can also find situations where bad actors can, if you can deceive a group of people, you can deceive them into behaving the way you want, even if it's not in their interests. So when we started this work, the January 6th insurrection was very fresh in our minds. And that was, a lot of that had to do, in our opinion, with deliberate disinformation campaigns. And so we were really interested in understanding, was this a new phenomenon? What causes it? How could you mitigate it? What are the incentives at play? And is there a way to interrupt them?
It strikes me as like, yeah, they do seem like two very different problems because, I mean, it's sort of the difference between a lie and a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, somebody is actively trying to get you to believe a lie. So they're a little trickier.
So if I've decided that I'm going to detect when something is false, if it's misinformation, then the person who is misinforming you is just like, oh, whoops, my bad, right? They're not going to try and build countermeasures against my detection.
Like defenses or anything.
Whereas disinformation, every time I figure out a way to detect that they're lying in a certain way, they'll say, oh, I need to lie in a slightly different way to get around that.
So what made you want to explore disinformation online?
So there is a couple things. I mean, first of all, it's just obviously a very important problem. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the top line. But why did I want to work on it instead of someone else? So I think one of the things that my group, thought we brought to the table was exactly the focus on the incentives, right? So it's not just about detecting this harmful information. You also have to set up the incentives right such that it actually gets mitigated or dealt with.
I think about tracking disinformation or finding it. A question that comes to mind is like, well, sort of like, well, we have spam with our email filters. Why can't we just set up a disinformation filter and just say, that's it, it's gone, you have to deal with it anymore?
This is something we thought about a lot, and I think that spam superficially seems really similar.
Yeah.
Right? It seems like I've got this kind of text or information or video or whatever. I need to evaluate whether it's likely to be harmful or not, and then I need to just skip it if it's harmful.
Yeah, put it out of my inbox. I don't want to see it.
But the difference between spam and disinformation or disinformation on social media platforms especially, is spam, the harm happens directly to the person who's getting it. Yeah. Okay, so if I receive this spam, I'm annoyed. I wish I hadn't had that. I can't read any of my other emails because it's all in the way. So if you give me a little machine that's going to detect it for me and maybe filter it somewhere else, I'm very delighted to do that. And the same thing with the email platforms. My email provider doesn't wish I got more spam. That's just more work for them. So everybody involved in the chain, except for the spammer, wants to detect the spam and get rid of it. Disinformation on social media platforms is different because the platforms themselves, the way they make their money is engagement, right? So their whole business model is increasing your engagement with material. And the problem here is disinformation is very engaging because it doesn't have to be true. So it can be anything else. And so you can tailor it to be as engaging as you want.
Yeah, you don't have to have truth get in the way of a really good story.
Exactly. And so that means that the platform, if they've got a steady stream of disinformation coming through, it's not necessarily harmful to the platform. It might actually drive extra engagement for them. And similarly, if I'm somebody reading it, if it's been well targeted at me, again, it's engaging, it's fun. So I don't necessarily wish that it had been filtered right there in the moment. And so it's very different from spam, because if you say to the platform, good news, I figured out a way to detect extremely engaging disinformation and I would like you to stop showing it to people, they'll say, thanks. But they might not necessarily do anything with it because it's not in their interests. Their incentive is to make the money from the engagement, and the way that you do that is by showing engaging material.
And they're really good at like hitting. I read stuff that I know I'm being kind of manipulated with this, but it's really good at hitting like the right outrage for me personally, or the right emotion.
I do get stuck on YouTube for a really long time sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're talking about incentives, but I'm wondering, maybe we could make it very clear. Like, what are the incentives in this problem? Sort of structure, can you lay it out for us?
Sure. So when we thought about this problem, we wanted to build a little toy model. And so we needed to make assumptions about what incentives everybody was facing. And so the first assumption that we made is that, in fact, disinformation is more engaging And it's therefore, if the platform is going to not show disinformation or in any way mitigate it, right, by putting a warning label or a fact check or anything, that imposes a cost on the platform. Right? I could have shown you this really engaging material, but instead I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put a little border around it, or I'm going to just not show it to you at all. That's a cost as far as the platform is concerned. So we modeled all mitigation efforts as something that's costly to the platform. It's not costly to society, right? To society, this is a net positive because there's less disinformation out there. But the platform doesn't bear the cost of disinformation. It just bears the cost of filtering. Right? So that was a really important assumption that we made. Another important assumption that we made is that because of that, they're only going to filter if you kind of make them. I'm saying filtering here, and again, I shouldn't. All mitigation is what we want to talk about, but in my head, that kind of gets rounded off to filtering. So the second assumption that we made is that they're not going to perform these costly mitigation efforts unless something makes them. What we assumed is that there is an external entity that's going to make them. So you could think about this as a regulatory agency. You could think about this as society at large, if there's just a backlash because people kind of recoil in disgust at what a hive of disinformation some particular platform has been. The basic idea here is that if you're not doing a specific thing, you might face a cost, where the cost is this backlash or this fine or something. So we were imagining there was going to be one big fine that happens if you don't do what you're supposed to do. So the way we modeled that was as a certain level of effort that is in some sense required. We left hazy where the requirement comes from. And then the third thing, which again comes back to spam, is we assumed that because you have to tell them exactly what effort to make, right? You can't say mitigate disinformation as much as you want because they'll say, I want to mitigate it 0. None. So instead they might say mitigate it by taking the following countermeasures. Okay, if I have to specify the countermeasures, one of the things that we know from spam is that any fixed set of countermeasures is going to become less effective over time. And
because people will start spelling things differently.
Exactly. Yeah. You'd replace the I with a 1 and you're golden, right? Yeah. And so we assume that any fixed set of requirements is going to become less effective over time. And then from the platform standpoint, what does that mean? It also means it becomes less costly over time because the mitigation is costly exactly to the extent that it's effective. Right. The third one was, we called it no strict liability. But what that means is that if a bad thing happens as a result of disinformation on a platform, so for instance, if there is an insurrection because of a bunch of coordination that's happening on a platform, we assume that you can't actually reliably trace that back. Okay, you can't hold the platform responsible for the actual direct harms that happen when they're diffuse or when there's some specific dramatic event.
So why would that be?
Why can we not do that? Well, this is very like pollution. Okay, so pollution, we know it's harmful. We know that people can die from it, and we know that it also has this kind of like broad, diffuse harm. And also, it's hard to really pin one particular event on one particular polluter. Right. So if I've got 7 factories that are all spewing pollution into the air, and then one person gets lung cancer, it's very hard for us to say this cancer was a result of this factory. Every one of these factories is going to be like, it's going to be like that Spider-Man meme. We're all pointing at each other.
Or it was like a result of the factory at all. It might have been.
Exactly. They might also just say like, we used to say if it was air pollution or if they just ate the wrong cigarette. And so we think that it's very similar with disinformation, right? If I say, they were all coordinating on Twitter, they got radicalized on Twitter, Twitter will say, no, they got radicalized on YouTube. You should really be looking at YouTube and so on, right? There's no way to really pin that down.
Right.
So what that means is that you do have to be in this regime where you tell them exactly what mitigation efforts you want them to take. You have to specify the countermeasures that they're going to take. If you could just hold them responsible for specific events, then life would get a lot easier because then they would be incentivized to mitigate disinformation to prevent those events from happening because they knew that they were going to bear the cost of the events. So in game theory and economics, you would call that internalizing the externality. You would call it making them bear the cost that they weren't previously bearing. So one of our really important assumptions is that we can't do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't say, well, that was the post that caused that.
Exactly. I'm gonna trace it back to these following things that you should have put a warning label on and you didn't, and therefore this bad thing happened. We assumed that wasn't possible.
You mentioned a little bit about the possibility of a regulatory or society being this external force. What did you find when it came to how effective that could be?
Yeah, so our results were a little discouraging.
Yeah.
So we found that when you put all these assumptions together, what we did is we created a little toy model that had where the platform is deciding what costs to bear, so how hard to mitigate, and society at large was deciding what countermeasures to require them to take. Okay, so there's these two entities making decisions.
Yeah.
And we found that it was possible that a platform would want to mitigate more than they were required to do. So this part's encouraging. Okay, so you might say, I'm going to require this amount of countermeasures. It's possible that the platform will do more than that. Okay, so this is what you hope is going to happen. Right?
Yeah.
You say this is the bare minimum, but you're going to do more because it's needed. But what we found is the only thing that would cause that to happen would be if a bad event happens. So if there's a situation where we need to define them or there's a backlash, the results of that backlash must be that they get required to do much more counterexamples than is actually socially optimal. Right? So taking society as a whole, including the platform, they're part of society. There's some amount of mitigation that makes sense. There's some amount of countermeasures that make sense for them to do. Right? The only way to be sure that no disinformation will get through is to just shut down.
Yeah.
And we don't think that's reasonable. We think that you do get positive benefits from these platforms. So there's always this balance between, well, how much cost should I bear and how much risk is enough to accept? Because I'm always going to have to accept some non-zero amount of risk. So there's a certain socially optimal amount of mitigation to do. And what we found is that the only way to convince a platform to do more than the bare minimum was with the threat that if something happens, you will now be required to do more than would be socially optimal. So more than we actually would have decided to do if our incentives were all aligned.
All right, so like they would have to be, this was going to be a harsh punishment.
So we thought of it as overreaction, right?
Yeah.
We said the only way to incentivize a platform to do more than the bare minimum is if they knew that if there's some bad event, that in fact their requirements would be an overreaction at the end of that. So they would have to do more mitigation than would even make sense if we were all deciding kind of in a cooperative way.
Is there a parallel there to climate change? Like what would be the corresponding incentive in climate change?
Yeah, so climate change is another situation where there's a lot of externalities, right?
Okay.
It's all about, I really want to pollute today and it'll be future generations or perhaps even just other people who bear the cost. So with climate change, again, there's the similarity where you don't have this direct line of responsibility. You have these externalized costs, and you have firms that might be willing to do more than their bare minimum requirement if they know that something terrible will happen to them if there is a backlash. Mm-hmm. So that's the stick.
So it does work in climate change?
I don't want to make claims about climate change because we didn't think about it specifically. So one of the things that's actually, and actually I should point out a difference because I'm not sure I agree. So one way in which it's very different from climate change is that climate change doesn't have this decreasing effectiveness assumption, right? So with disinformation,
pollution can't try to get around
exactly because it's not an agent.
Right.
It doesn't have incentives. It's just a thing that happens.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these results are driven by the idea that once I've fixed some requirements, the platform's cost and the effectiveness of their mitigation will over time decay.
Right.
Over time, it's going to get less and less effective. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily true for climate change. If we come up with a good way of mitigating the harms, it's not like they'll stop working if we don't keep changing.
Right, because carbon dioxide is carbon dioxide.
It just is what it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
And I guess on the point of when we're talking about disinformation on platforms, when you talk about this kind of draconian overreaction almost, then you start getting into questions of, freedom of expression. And
well, exactly. It's not desirable for us to threaten an overreaction, right? Yeah. The whole point of something being more costly than would be the social optimum is that it's more costly than would be the social optimum. Like socially, we would prefer, collectively, we would prefer something less costly. And so that's why I call the results a little discouraging, right? Yeah. We either need to say we're going to threaten you to do something that's not really what we should have done in the first place, or we need to accept that we're going to have underinvestment in countermeasures. There's actually one of the results that kind of came out of this is there's under all of these assumptions, there's no reliable way to incentivize exactly the right amount of countermeasures. right? So even if I'm able to say I will overreact, which maybe I can say that, and maybe I can't, there's no way to optimally target the countermeasures. And that's because we don't know how the effectiveness and the costs relate to each other. So this is something that comes from the fact that we don't have a direct line into the company's data or into their techniques, right? They bear a certain cost for mitigating disinformation, and they also that their mitigations will have a certain effectiveness, which is related to that. But the relationship between the harmfulness of the content and the cost of the mitigation is in some sense private information. And again, this is something that game theory thinks about a lot. Thinks about when one of the agents knows some stuff that the other agent doesn't. And so one of the things we found is that if I don't have direct access to your costs, if I don't know exactly how costly mitigation is going to be, there's no way for me to target how much cost you should incur.
And I guess they're incentivized not to release those in a lot of ways.
Yeah, they really don't want you to know, right? And part of that is, well, because then you might incentivize me to take these costs, but also just for reasons that aren't part of the model, right? It's just the more information that companies give you about their private processes, the less of a competitive advantage they have for those private processes.
Would there also be the concern that the more information that you give about what your costs are would make it easier for people who are trying to produce disinformation to?
That's a really good point. Yeah. I mean, if the way that you're telling about your costs is talking about exactly what the mitigation efforts are, well, that might just accelerate the arms race where the disinformers can circumvent your techniques more easily.
We talked about incentives a lot, but do you see any role in AI for being a technical tool to fight disinformation?
Yeah. I mean, so I kind of hand-waved that away earlier on. I said that the incentives are super important. And that's what my work focused on, or our work, I should say. This is joint with my student Churros. What we did to hand-wave it away is we assumed that the technical problem was solved. So we said, suppose that the technical problem is perfectly solved and I can perfectly detect disinformation. Then turns out the problem's not solved. There's all these incentive issues, and we started digging into the incentive issues. But of course, the technical problem is not solved. And so there's a huge role for AI in solving the technical problem and getting better at detecting disinformation and understanding how it spreads and why it spreads and what factors make it more or less harmful. But there's also a role for the kind of artificial intelligence that I do more, which is managing incentives, understanding incentives, and designing incentives. A lot of what causes this issue or causes this incentive misalignment is the particular business model that we've all arrived at for social media platforms, which is that they sell engagement. Right? They have a whole bunch of engaging material, and regardless of how good or bad that material is, if it's engaging, that's the main thing that they need to target. It's not written in stone that has to be how things work. And so one potential direction is to think about, like, what are the different ways that we could even organize how platforms make money. Obviously, that's very speculative, but that's the kind of thing that incentive design thinks about.
So we could change it to be like subscription. Like, what are you talking about when you're talking about?
I'm talking about that, and I'm talking also about can we figure out a way to differentially incentivize kinds of content. Right now, engagement. That's the ticket. But it doesn't just have to be engagement. You could think about how valuable content is. You could think about paying for it in a different way than advertising. It's all sorts of business model-y stuff, but incentives are all part of that as well.
Really looking at the structure that we've built, not just trying to bolt kind of solutions on top.
Something that I think is really valuable to think about is that this is not the first time that disinformation has been a big problem in society. Right? This has happened every time we've had a new information platform. So printing press, broadcast media. Every time it happens, you get a big spike in propaganda and disinformation and misinformation. So one thing that's perhaps valuable to think about is how have we solved this problem before? Right? I'm not suggesting that it's perfectly solved, but we went through periods of very high propaganda, and then we went through periods where it was less of a problem. I think a lot of the way that we solved it the most recent couple of times around was we solved it by starting to understand what are the sources that you can trust. What are the sources of information that are going to give you trustworthy information? And part of how we solved that was by having certain outlets or platforms more privileged. Like they were trusted because they had prestige. So we kind of added gatekeepers. I'm not sure that's the direction we want to go this time around.
I'm not sure we could go that direction, because there's already this like backlash against the mainstream media.
Absolutely.
And I do think you lose a lot of the value of voices that don't have the resources that but are still trustworthy and
exactly. Yeah. Having these kind of centralized trust structures had these benefits, but it wasn't without cost.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of the value that you get out of distributed media like social media is exactly that you don't have to go through a single point of trustworthiness. But one of the things that we think about in AI is distributed models of trust. And so that's another direction that you could go to imagine how could you mitigate this problem. Could you think about ways of understanding where the trustworthy information is coming from in a way that doesn't rely on these kind of single choke point, prestigious gatekeepers?
So, but what does that look like?
More research is needed. But I think that it would look like understanding where should I get my information from, and how can I certify that it makes sense.
Right. To me, that sounds like education.
It does sound like education, doesn't it? And again, that is maybe the high level version of what I was saying before, is that people started to understand where trust sort of deserved to go. Mm-hmm. And so part of that is just people learning to navigate the new sources of information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's kind of interesting, like you had mentioned before, but I think when you hear a word like disinformation, it sounds like a very modern problem, a very new problem, but really isn't. I mean, disinformation has probably been a problem as long as we've been communicating with each other.
I mean, a lie is disinformation.
Yeah.
So really, as
my kids do it all the time.
As far back as speech. Yeah. My children run disinformation campaigns pretty regularly.
I definitely did not break that. Yeah. We don't know how it happened. But,
no. What incentives do they have?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They don't.
My allowance. Also, I'm not tired. Other disinformation campaign.
So for yourself personally, is there a particular area you want to look at next? Do you have any research plans on this?
Yeah. So one of the things that we started thinking about in this project and then veered away to more of this toy model was we thought a lot about the human behavior aspect. And so I'd really like to start zeroing in more on that. Like I said at the beginning, a lot of my work has to do with modeling how people behave, predicting how they're going to respond to things. I think that being able to predict and model human response to disinformation and how they make a decision and what the results of it are, I think that's super important. And I think that it's underexplored. I think that we think a lot about how can I detect it, how can I prevent it, but I think understanding what makes it effective and really like what are the incentives facing people who read disinformation, right? Like part of the problem is that the person at the very end of the disinformation pipeline might not be so incentivized not to read it. And so understanding what causes that and how you might fix it is something I think is really exciting.
And that's an interesting point about what's their responsibility on this? Because I agree, it's, you get something outlandish and it's a lot easier to share and talk with friends and stuff, but
yeah, right. we face a lot of incentives too, right? Like it's I'm going to share this very exciting thing, even though I know that maybe it's nonsense. How does that feed into my behavior, and how does that change how disinformation spreads?
How often do you share something with an amazing headline and you haven't actually read?
Never.
You have no idea.
Yeah. Just to wrap it up and think about it at a high level, you've talked a lot about how the incentive structure can make it difficult to think about how to move forward, but is there something we can think about moving forward at a larger scale that might be positive?
Yeah, so I think that it's discouraging that the current incentive structure doesn't behave the way we want it to. I think the encouraging thing is that neither the incentive structure nor the way the world works has to be fixed. So when we know what it is about the incentives that are producing the bad results, that lets us focus our attention on what we should be trying to change.
And your work showed us what it is about the incentive structure that are causing.
Yes, we sort of pinpointed which of our assumptions were leading to these poor results. And we have some ideas about how to relax those assumptions or even to contradict them. in the real world so that they're not true any longer.
So what that means is that you had made some assumptions in your work, and the question going forward is how to change the world such that those incentives don't hold.
Yeah, exactly. So we made these assumptions. We think they describe the world pretty well.
Right.
But if you change the world in certain ways, then some of those assumptions will no longer hold. That means that our negative results will also no longer hold.
Right. Good. Yeah. And so what could we change?
We were going to go that far.
It also kind of strikes me that, I mean, one of the things about disinformation that's so insidious is that you're not aware when you're being lied to. So it kind of strikes me that even just by really digging in and starting to ask the question, that's a step forward in progress, because now we can...
One of the interesting things about disinformation behaviorally is that people sometimes know that they're talking about something that's ridiculous or making ridiculous claims, and they get benefits from it beyond just informing each other. So sometimes disinformation can be a signal that you're part of a group.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes disinformation can be a way of committing to being part of that group. You say, I'm going to say this thing that anybody else would think is odious, but my group thinks is awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where the behavioral side comes in. What are the incentives that face people for spreading disinformation or propagating it beyond just the desire to inform or even just the desire to entertain? There's other incentives that we might face to make certain claims or spread certain claims that have been given to us.
Right. It's like you have this group of friends and you always talk about a particular thing, and like that's how you build that friendship. And so if that friendship is built around a particular piece of information or a particular, political identity, it would be hard to change that, is what you're saying. But you could work on other ways that people could build those communities that weren't necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, we could. So, and part of what this tells us too is that some kinds of natural countermeasures that you might try are actually counterproductive. Right. So sometimes really heaping scorn on someone for an obviously ridiculous idea can backfire, because part of the point of having an obviously ridiculous belief is to mark yourself as somebody who is willing to make that sacrifice to be part of the group.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you make that more valuable to them, it can actually have the opposite effect that you might hope for.
Right. They dig their heels in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's tricky because you don't just want to say, well, then I guess everything is fine and I won't ever point out that something is ludicrous.
Yeah.
But it does tell you that sometimes the most intuitive way to fight disinformation is not going to be the most effective way. And this is actually something that's very common in game theory generally, is that it has a lot of counterintuitive results where you do the thing that seems like it's obviously going to work and it can actually do the opposite.
I was just going to say that seems like a little bit of incentive structure too. Like
yes.
How are people incentivized in their social relationships, and how can you differently incentivize them based on your behavior?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's like game theory, but now it's game theory inside of game theory.
Yes.
I love it.
It's double game theory.
I mean, and the nice thing about game theory is that there can be games in the games. It's like, it's really cool.
It's games all the way down.
I'm just doing my head in.
Well, thank you for coming, James.
It's been a real pleasure.
A really amazing conversation. I think we touched so many interesting points, and again, the game theory on game theory is that's definitely going to stick with me.
Thanks again.
I'm incentivized to learn more. So
follow that incentive, Scott.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us.